part in the front lawn. And so unlike the students in some of these other universities, they really are fearless about doing things with their hands, and they're fearless about DIY, like doing it yourself. Because there's maybe not as much money in this community, people aren't always just buying the next latest, greatest thing. Instead, they're making do and building things they need for themselves. So it turns out that these students are really ideal for BioWare. They're not afraid of making mistakes. They're not afraid of trying something new. And like physically, mechanically manipulating life. And their enthusiasm is endless. And in the class, we do a variety of things. So we do like higher end stuff. So this is like the genetic manipulation of bacteria, so they're phosphoresces. And the students always like this one because it makes them look really smart and like real scientists. We do other things like in this last one I showed you here. I always teach them hydroponics. And I tell them that if the art thing doesn't work out for them, maybe that could become another form of employment. We go visit a lot of labs. So these are some students doing interpretive cloning dance in a lab on main campus. And the students do a variety of art projects themselves. So this is one of the students we had a few years ago, Tokyo Webster. And she started doing printmaking, but she used bacteria as her ink rather than ink. So she would do lino cuts. I don't know if any of you do relief printing. You cut these images into this linoleum, and then rather than putting ink on it, she would paint bacteria onto it, and then she would press that linoleum into clean petri dishes. And then within 24 hours, the image would start to grow. This is another student of mine. She's a graduate student. She's now going on to do her PhD. Amanda White did a project for her MFA thesis called Frugivore to the lab. Now, she called it Frugivore, but we always called it poop tomatoes. And the reason for that is that she went to the grocery store and bought a beautiful container of tomatoes. And she went home and she ate them all. And the next day she collected her poop and she planted it. And out of that poop grew like a greenhouse filled of tomatoes. And she did that 2 or 3 times. So she'd then eat the tomatoes in the greenhouse and do it again. And she got like 3 or 4 generations of these poop tomatoes. And she really was sort of like investigating interspecies communication, right? Before this, she'd been trying to paint signs for birds, and she realized that birds don't speak English, and they don't see signs the way we do. So she was really trying to think about what are real ways that her body communicates with other organisms. And so she realized that seed scarification is a real important way, that the enzymes in our stomach and the digestive tract scarify, but also treat the seeds as they're going through your body. And then large mammals often disperse seeds in the wild, right? And she got thinking about how toilets were like a Terminator technology and preventing these seeds from being free. And so the poop tomato started. We do a lot of shows. This is in our gallery at the university. Here we have a student who baked her own bread, and then she used a laser engraver to write in the bread a story about the origin of biotechnology as women's work. And that she was thinking about how yeast and leavened bread could be considered one of the earliest forms of biotechnology. Another student here built a table that had enormous petri dishes in it. And in the middle of each petri dish, she placed, she filled them with agar, and she placed doilies she bought at the Salvation Army, like from little old ladies. And then those doilies just loomed because they were covered in so much bacteria, they became really grotesque. And then we started traveling these shows. So this one we did last year at the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto. And it was sort of a 5-year retrospective of some of the best student projects that came out of the lab in the last few years. I also like to do a lot of these sort of outdoor, and relating back to my own practice, where I sort of collaborations with my class. So I started doing these outdoor labs. This is when I first moved to Windsor here, called where I've got a tent trailer, and we set up a camping experience where we were doing DNA extractions and making hot cocoa at the same time. And this is on the Huron Church Highway between Windsor and Detroit. We started doing parades, because parades are a great way to trick people into looking at art. So this is the Art and Ecology Parade we did to the streets of Windsor. And I'm on my megaphone and I'm calling out to people, to let's hear it for bacteria, and then everyone's going, yay, bacteria! And we're talking about all the different organisms like invasive species and pets and gardens that we share our ecology with. We did another parade. This one was focused on organisms that bioluminesce at night. And this was in Toronto as part of the Nuit Blanche in 2013. And I travel a lot with my students, so I'll often take them on these sort of road trips. This is a workshop we did in Montreal with Stellar, bioremediation, and we did some of my, taking specimens on a hike. But we also went in the lab and worked with some scientists, and then we workshopped student projects with Stellar. And the last thing I want to sort of say about my lab is that we're moving to a new location. The University of Windsor is building a new arts complex downtown. And so currently our building is hidden away in an industrial area, and it's got mold, it smells bad, and there are no windows. And in this new environment, the lab is going to be a performance space. So it'll become a venue as well. And the lab is going to be right off the main atrium of the new arts building. And this wall onto the atrium is going to be glass. So it'll be like the Exploratorium in San Francisco, where people just walking by can watch us do our work in the lab. But also we're decorating the lab with a chandelier, and there's going to be it's going to be wired for video and sound and have theatrical lighting, so we can do live performances in that space. So I'm thinking of those earlier images I was doing in the labs. I could do those for audiences. I was thinking about doing a bioart opera in the lab. The new lab will be a BSL Level 2 lab, so our current lab is a BSL Level 1, which means it's essentially like a high school safety level, whereas the new one will be able to use human byproducts and some harmful substances. So from a very small idea in this sort of little ramshackle space, we're actually going to build an institution that will, through bricks and mortar, express some of these sort of foldings and unfoldings that I've been talking to you about. And the last thing I want to talk to you about before I go is just what I'm up to now. Everything you've seen so far is really resolved. This is a project called Windsor Yeast. In Windsor, there is a distillery. Windsor made a lot of money during Prohibition, distilling hard alcohol and then running it across the border to Detroit. And in fact, Al Capone owned property in Windsor, and there was a whole, a direct line. So still, those distilleries are still running today. And when I moved to Windsor, it's a very industrial town, kind of like Detroit, but a tenth of the size. And twice a week, you can smell in my neighborhood yeast floating through the air. And it's really thick, the air is thick, and you can taste the yeast. And I got thinking about how this bio waste from this industrial process was flavoring the city so much, and we were actually ingesting some of it every time we could smell it. And on the one hand, it's kind of yucky and intimidating, and I'm critical of it. But on the other hand, I find it very comforting and soothing. I don't know if you guys have smelled spent yeast, but it smells really sweet and sticky. And it reminds me of my dad making beer and wine in our basement when I was a kid. So I started this project called Windsor Yeast, where I took all these photographs of Windsor, and then I would put them in the backs of Petri dishes, and I grew yeast samples from all around the city into the images. And they become like this one for me looks like maybe a spirit coming down from the sky, maybe an alien, This one looks like fireworks or rain. So they become these little stories, these fictional stories about the microecology of our space. And I've since been traveling with this little workshop I do now. So I teach people how to do this in their own town. This is from Amsterdam Yeast. I just did one last week in Leamington. And now this has turned into a show that's traveling right now as well. The other thing I've been thinking a lot about, and I told you earlier about the sort of human organism, I've been thinking that maybe biotechnology could be interpreted as a technology of love, and that there could be a mutualism between the relationships that we have with between us and the organisms within the lab. And I did a ton of research about those types of mutualisms, and it's really led me to think a lot about practices that are maybe historical or just non-Western that are already like long human trajectories of mutualistic relationships between species that could really teach us how to do biotechnology better. And when I say that in particular, because I'm from Canada and I have some relationship in that area, I think a lot about First Nations communities. And I'm thinking a lot about the types of art and artifacts produced in that environment really involve a lot of embodied biological materials. But I think that we could look to other traditions and around the world of long-standing, complicated relationships between humans and animals that have been solved through other strategies rather than objectivity and rationality. And I'm thinking about exploring those histories and attempting to apply them within a laboratory environment, within my own lab. So maybe our bioethics in my lab will look very different than it would be in a traditional lab. To that end, I've been going up north a lot lately. Last summer I went and lived up north with, I went with the University of Manitoba for a Native Studies program, and we went hunting and fishing with the Inuit community in the Arctic. And I got to see firsthand and learn a lot from the local ecology and the local community about maybe other models for understanding interspecies relations, and thinking about how the practices that we can do in the lab could be reinterpreted through those models. And I think also I've become interested in the Arctic in my quest to find real nature. I'm finding it's not really natural up there either. But one of the things I find very interesting about the Arctic is that I do think I'm finding the edge of capitalism when I go into those spaces. And in those types of environments, you will find whole portions of the communities living off the land and living outside of the model of capitalism. And you see that rubbing up against like mega oil refineries and government regulations all in the same environment. So it's been very productive. And I don't have any images yet, although I might have one right here. I have just got back from sailing in the Arctic. I went to the island of Svalbard in Norway. And I went, I just got back a couple weeks ago. I went with this group out of New York City, and they commission annually a boat. Let's see if I can find you a picture of this boat. It's crazy. And we went sailing in the Arctic for 2 weeks. Of course, I'm not going to find anything in the boat. And while I was there, I built a greenhouse in my studio, or in my bunk, and I grew all of these little organisms in the greenhouse, and I took these living plants with me on these Arctic adventures. And I made videos of them, and oh, here's the boat we were on. And I let them go, I floated them in the ocean. I did not release them anywhere because I'm very careful about, here's one towards the end, so these are some of the organisms I've grown. So again, I'm trying to think about alternative relationships with these other species, how they could apply for real in the lab, how they need to be influenced by the larger ecology we live in, but also maybe in terms of human trajectories and human knowledges, we need to widen our definitions of what types of knowledge might be appropriate and useful and knowledgeable in this space. And that's everything. That was a mouthful. Are there any questions? And don't be shy.
I may be just wrongly inferring this, but it sounds like you're pretty critical of traditional biotechnology or biotechnology as a practice. I was wondering if you could be more specific about things that you're working against,
Sure.
or practices that not.
Sure. So I think that when I first started in this field, I was really very critical, maybe blanket critical. And I really retracted from that. I think that the hard sciences have an enormous resources and value and types of knowledge to offer us. I think for me, the concern is that through the model of objectivity, the hard sciences and a lot of the business that's connected and driving the hard sciences is not very open or aware or even willing to discuss or engage in the other messages and knowledges affiliated with the practices. And so I'll give you an example. We were talking about some of the work I've been doing in the Arctic. On the one hand, going up to the Arctic really taught me a lot about colonialism as it's practiced today, against people, against land, but also it made it inherently visible to me the colonialism affiliated with the scientific practices that we engage in today. And I always knew that more conceptually, but I was able to really see and understand that the idea of taking the entire natural world and dividing it down into these little digestible pieces and measuring and owning and weighing each of those pieces is in itself an attempt to control through a perceived objective stance the natural world, whereas that's not objective at all. It meets very specific cultural criteria and goals. So I would like for some of that discourse to come into the hard sciences in terms of how we critique and engage and ask the sciences to help us co-produce our future, but maybe also in terms of scientific education and scientific practice. I'd like to think about how those types of discussions could happen every day in labs. And really simple, goofy things, like we could do sun salutations in the morning in the lab before we move to, our lab meeting. Or, I mean, that's goofy, but it's actually really real. To think about other ways of being in that space and validating and acknowledging the other knowledges that we're missing out on. I think science can be better if it accounted for these other knowledges. So that's one example. Another thing that really concerns me is the manipulation of life. I think that through that objective model and through this sort of dissecting that happens conceptually but also physically, I'm not sure that we're being very good to ourselves or to the other organisms in the lab. And I think we might get better results if we looked at collaborative models and really looked at things like biomimicry as in a way to, if an organism is getting everything it wants and you can also benefit from that, isn't that better than depriving or harming organisms towards your ends? So I want to think about those types of strategies. And the last thing, sort of general, so those are my pop general areas, and then the last thing that sort of concerns me is that I think, especially now in our current, since, economic crisis, I think that economics and corporate desires are driving a lot of science, and I think that, these two other things I said before, they're actually, scientists are wonderful, talented, intelligent people who are very, impassioned about what they do, and I find that they are now also under maybe some of the same pressure that the arts has been under to produce entertainment, or do you know what I mean? Things that will produce economic revenue within 2 years or less. And so I see an editing process happening in the hard sciences, and I see a muzzling happening in the hard sciences that doesn't allow for, where economic drives are becoming more important. And maybe in the general public we don't know that as well. I think the scientists are fully aware of that pressure. And I don't know what it's like down here in the States as much, but also our government in Canada, we have a lot of government-funded research labs, and they have really been, we had 40 of them. There were environmental research labs shut down in the last 5 years, and all their data destroyed, hundreds of years of ecological data because it is counterproductive to the oil and gas industry. So like this is a serious concern. So I love scientists and science, but I have some thoughts and suggestions on how we can do it better. and lastly, I think that if we only allow economic goals to determine our biotechnological future, we're in big trouble.
I think you said something along the lines of like you went to a national park, but it was you were looking for something like not colonized. Is that the word you used, colonized?
Yeah, or natural.
Okay. What are your qualifications for natural? Because like I guess what I see is natural in a national park probably isn't. And are there any places that you have found that are besides the Arctic that are natural? And how are you sure to make sure that you don't alter that?
So I think what I'm finding is I don't think that anything meets my criteria for natural at all anymore. But if I change my criteria for natural, then it's all natural. So when I grew up near Banff National Park, so in my mind that was always nature when I was a kid. And when I went there and started working as an adult and doing this work, I really realized that even though it's beautiful and things are alive, the human control expressed over that space is very substantial. So for example, almost every bear in the park is tagged. They know where it is all the time, right? They control how many buffalo are in the park or not in the park, whether or not you're allowed to bring something into the park, as a tourist or as a scientist, what you're allowed to take out of the park, all of that is really controlled. Another good example would be like Niagara Falls. They can turn it off. There's actually a dam before the falls, and so if someone falls in, they turn off the falls. Like, so there's this idea in our mind when we're experiencing these natural environments and you feel like the power of the water and you're like, this is, I feel alive, I'm an organism. Really, a lot of that has already been dominated in some way. Now, and even when I got to the Arctic, I thought I would find this really pristine stuff, but really it's just more, it's bigger business and it's more government control in other ways. So, but what's happened in the end for me conceptually about nature is that I've been wondering a lot about whether or not what we're doing, like if this room and this talk and my work in the lab, if this is natural. And at first I always assumed that it was unnatural because it was man-made or artificial or plastics. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that even plastics are made of petrochemicals, which is organisms that were dead millions of years ago that have been compressed under pressure to make petrochemical that we can now extract it and turn them into plastics. So on the one hand, I could say nothing is natural, but on the other hand, if I look at, there's a scientist whose name is Richard Lewontin, and he writes about ecology, and he says that every organism consumes resources and produces wastes, and that the sign of an ecology is when there's another organism that then consumes that waste and produces other wastes, and that all of these life forms are all interconnected in some way. And if I think about the human impact or the Anthropocene on the world, we could go one of two ways. We could say that we've colonized every space and none of this is natural, or we could actually think that maybe we're just, a very domineering organism that may at some point go extinct, that's pooping all over the place, but that our actions, even though they seem really technological, are actually also natural.
Okay, I'm curious about, have you shown this to us, a very specific population, for example, like scientists versus artists, and I'm kind of curious about the responses that you might get from different populations depending on their specialties.
Sure, I've shown this, I do talks everywhere, and I do a lot of talks in scientific environments. I'm not often invited into scientific environments to do talks. I contact them usually, although now that I've been doing this for a long time, and you know, like if I go to a lab or I'm doing something, and you know, they'll ask me to do a talk. But still, the talks in science departments are always really funny because whoever introduces me doesn't really know what to say, and then I talk for a while, and my jokes, like, some people laugh, people are like, oh. And then usually at the end I turn on the lights and everyone's eyes are like this big. And one in particular, I remember that one of the senior scientists stood up and said, "What does this have to do with any of us? Why are you wasting our time?" And he stormed out of the room. So like quite often there's like a shock, and there's some initial people who maybe think that that these discussions don't have any relevance to the types of decisions they're making in that space. But what always happens is that I make sure I'm around for another day, after the talk at least, and usually the grad students start approaching me first. Like a couple of them will come and say, "You know what you said today was really cool. I was thinking about so-and-so, my girlfriend, she does art," or do you know what I mean? Like there'll be those types of things, and then, so maybe quite often I get a couple collaborative relationships out of master's and PhD level students. And then usually like one of the senior scientists will invite me to his or her office later. Like they don't want to publicly embrace what I'm doing, but I've got a lot of long-term collaborative relationships that are doing that. And so as long as you're happy to put up with the, you know, because it's embarrassing giving a talk to a bunch of people who don't want to hear it. As long as I can get through that, it's usually very fruitful, like a day and a half later. A lot of the scientists I work with, they usually later will be really surprised and impressed and say that they knew they had something to offer me, but they didn't know that artists had something to offer them. A couple of scientists on the camp were really shocked, particularly by Paul's PCR project. It blew their minds that someone who was not a scientist could come up with that and that it worked. And that maybe artists could think about science differently or reverse engineer different technologies. And quite often, even though like I'm very good at microscopy, I do a lot of microscopy for scientists, like I'll often do rote skills. I want to learn microsurgery next year, so I'm going to go do, and I'll work like as an assistant to a scientist doing that. But what I really find that at the end, they always say to me that like, you ask me questions I never thought of before about my research. And even though I can't provide them with answers, like I'm not a scientist, but sometimes I ask questions that make you think about your research very differently and can be helpful. Then another example though is sometimes if I present my work in high art environments, like in a white cube museum environment, there's usually some, you know, more senior person who stands up and says, "What does this have to do with us?" and leaves the room. like there'll be these similar reactions because I don't make objects that look nice hanging over your couch or that you could sell. Commercial galleries are not really sure what to do with bio artists. There's a couple commercial galleries who deal in bio art right now. And a lot of the, you know, things that I do, maybe they aren't art. Maybe they're community engagement, maybe it's pedagogy, I don't know. So there's some of that. And then my home audience are more like hybrid spaces like this class, where maybe some of those assumptions have already been made. And then I love doing stuff for non-specialists, like I love going to high schools, or I love going to like a community art center where last week they had maybe like a watercolorist come in and talk about his or her work. Like I like to sort of like photobomb audiences who are not expecting this. And that usually goes really well. As long as I have tea and cookies afterwards, we're good. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Your topic, bio the art. So this is something to make it artistic or bio of anything, biology, or is it sort of art, natural, in that natural sense? And so you exposing people, you deliver the message.
This is a good question. This is more maybe my personal opinion, right? So like there's a lot, bio art goes very wide, and yes, a lot of bio art exhibits will be just like microscopy, like you know, beautiful images that come from science, or a texture, or an organism that comes from science. some bio artists are very technical, like maybe engineering or design backgrounds, right? So they think bio art needs to include a machine that pumps, keeps things alive. And the type of bio art I'm interested in engaging in is not nearly as technical and is not really just enjoying the beauty of life. It's sort of somewhere in the middle, and really, I come from a fine arts background. I don't know if you noticed or not, but a lot of the images refer to art historical, like lighting strategies, or I really love historical painting, so you'll notice there's often these sort of subtexts in my work that are, I did a whole body of work around the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tolk, for example. So for me, the bio art happens when there's got to be something living or recently deceased involved. From my perspective, again, this is not the law, this is my, and I'm really open about that. It could be taxidermy, it could be, algae, but I think for me, the art part is as important as the bio, and so I think that engaging in the history of representation, in making things, and creating experiences for audiences that are transformative or transportive is as important as having a living organism and a technical thing happening at the same time.
I have a follow-up question on this. You mentioned other aspects of this besides visualization, like smell. So this kind of art is not a visual art in that sense.
It is a multimodal art. And it's funny because I show you this slideshow, but you haven't seen bio art. And I actually, a lot of people misunderstand this. They think if they've seen a document, they think they've seen the project. But I would argue in my own theoretical writing that part of what is so important about bio art is the vitality of the art itself. Those little sculptures that were alive, or holding an organism in your hand, there is an embodied experience of that other life that is temporal, that involves smell, that involves empathy. And so a lot of my projects are about creating workshops or moments where regular people can have this moment between themselves and an organism that originates from the lab and gives them that vital experience. And a photograph and a story and a video don't communicate that essential quality. So does that help you for your class? Does that line up with some of the things that you guys have been discussing so far? Is there anything else that came up in the class you want my opinion on? Yeah.
Okay, so the question that I've sort of been asking each week is sort of how do you get involved in each artist or person that's come through has sort of come at this in an entirely different way.
Yeah.
And the person who was here last week was